Okay, we're going to do something a little bit different in this video. I'm going to give a talk that I wrote several years ago when I was still teaching in Tokyo about Akutagawa Ryunosuke's famous short story, Yabu no Naka, translated as In a Grove, published in 1922. And it was, of course, made into the famous film by Kurosawa Akira in 1950 called La Shomon. Okay, so as part of this class, we're going to be watching the film La Shomon, which is based on the story Yabu no Naka. I've already made a separate study guide about that work by Akutagawa, so you can watch that and answer the questions on that. But in this video, I'm going to read the short talk that I gave on Akutagawa many years ago in Tokyo, at a university in Tokyo. I was teaching there, and I will intersperse the entire text, the entire story, in this video. Okay, so I'll read sections of my paper, and then when I talk about testimony 1, I'll read testimony 1 in full, all the way through the final testimony of the work, which is testimony 7. So I'll read the entire work as I explain and give my ideas from this paper. Okay, so the paper was tentatively titled Yabu no Naka in a Grove as a Meditation on the Question, What is Woman? By R. Sheldon Morrison. Okay, and the translation I'll be reading for this is by Lippit. I think it's not the Rubin translation. J. Rubin has done a more recent translation, which is probably a better translation, but the only translation I have at my disposal right now is the one by Lippit, so I'll be reading that. I'll perhaps make another video at some point in which I read the original Japanese as well. Okay, so I'll start with the paper. Yabu no Naka as a meditation on the question, what is woman? Akutagawa Ryunosuke's Yabu no Naka, translated by J. Rubin, I say here, but translated by Lippit as In a Grove, first published in the, let me see what the translation actually is, In a Grove, yeah, by Lippit. Seiji M. Lippit is the translation I'll be reading. As In a Grove, where'd we go? Hold on 1 second, my essay disappeared. Okay. Akutagawa Ryunosuke's Yabu no Naka, first published in the January 1922 edition of the prominent literary journal Shincho, has often been described as a kind of parable about modern perspectivism, sort of Nietzschean perspectivism, the unknowability of truth, and the breakdown of totalizing worldviews. Okay, so those are the standard readings. It's usually what students write about when they write their papers on this story, about the idea that there's no ultimate truth, that everybody has their own version of truth, and we can never arrive at final truth. That's the sort of standard interpretation of the story. It's read as a parable. But this reading of the work obscures more than it clarifies. In fact, the work is a meditation on the question, what is woman? The answer to this question, revealed in the final testimony, is so terrifying that the main character in the story, the young aristocrat Kanazawa no Takehiko, presumably stabs himself in the chest the moment he discovers the answer to the question, what is woman? Yabu no Naka is based on an episode in Konjaku Monogatari Shu. It's a famous collection of setsuwa, or anecdotal tales from the 10th century. In that version of the story, the original version of the story, an aristocrat and his wife are attacked by a bandit while traveling along a mountain path. The wife is raped, the bandit flees, and they proceed on their way. Aside from this basic plotline, everything else in Akutagawa's story was added by the author himself. And I should note, we've read several Akutagawa stories in this class. I should note that this is a preferred method of Akutagawa, to take something from the classical past, often from this collection of setsuwa, anecdotal tales, Konjaku Monogatari Shu, to take that and use the bare bones of that story as a kind of launching starting point for writing a new work that focuses on different aspects and different themes and so forth. But this style of appropriation was often used by Akutagawa. Keep that in mind as we read this. In 1950, the director Kurosawa Akira adapted Akutagawa's story into the acclaimed film La Shomon, which we'll be watching after we finish this story. The film became an international sensation, and since its release, much has been written on both Akutagawa's story and the film. The great bulk of this criticism focuses on the purported philosophical message of the work, namely the idea that I mentioned above. The idea that there is no ultimate reality or truth, but only an irreducible multiplicity of subjective perspectives. A term was even coined, the Rashomon effect, to explain this phenomenon, which has since been referenced and parodied in numerous novels, films, plays, and even several American sitcoms. I think Scooby-Doo, the cartoon for kids, did an episode that was called the Rashomon effect or something like that, back in the 80s. Akutagawa's story borrows the form of the whodunit mystery. In all, 7 witnesses provide testimonies of what they purportedly saw. Very little matches up. Although the ghost of the dead husband Takehiko appears at the end of the story through a medium, a usual cue to the reader that the truth will at last be revealed, this final testimony adds only another layer of confusion. The reader wants to piece together the puzzle, but the pieces don't fit. Without any omniscient narrator to tell us what really happened, the story ends with the truth lost somewhere in the Yabu no naka, in the grove, in the bushes. But Akutagawa did not write this story simply to make a facile point about the evasiveness of truth. It is my view that his motivation lay elsewhere, namely, in a question far more profound and problematic, the question, what is woman? Alright, the 7 representations of Masago. Moving along, the focal character in the story is Masago, widow of Takehiko and rape victim of Tajio. Okay, so the 3 main characters in the story, write them down if you don't have it on if you don't have your study guide in front of you. Masago is the main female character who is possibly raped by Tajio, who's the second character, and then her husband is the third character, Takehiko. She and her mother also appears and gives one of the testimonies. She and her mother are the story's only female characters. Though a non-entity in the first testimony and alluded to only briefly as a peripheral figure in the following 2 testimonies, Masago's presence grows with each witness's account, ultimately becoming the dominant ordering force in the work, effectively swallowing up the other characters and indeed the story itself. In each of the 7 testimonies, Masago embodies a different aspect or archetype of woman. In the first testimony, she represents woman as absence. I'll explain that later, below. In the second, she is woman as enigma. In the third, she is woman as nameless object of male desire. In the fourth testimony, she is the obedient daughter and faithful wife. The sort of ideal in Confucian societies, ideal female in Confucian societies. In the fifth, she is presented as a kind of kindai josei, a modern woman, showing influences of the modern-gade, or moga, phenomenon that was popular in the early Showa, late Taisho and early Showa periods. This word modern-gade, or moga, appeared around 1923. In the 6th episode, she is the traditional female ideal who embodies the virtues of fragility, meekness, and fidelity to husband, and so forth. And in the final testimony, she is woman as pure, unbridled feminine desire or will. Okay, in the first testimony, Masago represents woman as absence. This is the testimony of the woodcutter, the kigori. There is no mention of Masago, no direct mention of her. At this point, she has not yet been made the object of male desire and therefore does not yet exist. Right, so now I'm going to read that testimony, the kigori no. I forget what the original is. We'll have to look at that later. Okay, so the first testimony is from the kigori, the story of the woodcutter questioned by the Grand Magistrate. Yes, it's just as you say. I was the one who found the body. Like always, I went deep into the mountains this morning to cut cedars. I found the body in a grove hidden in the shadows of the mountain. Where was it? 400 or 500 yards off the Yamashina Station Road. It's a deserted grove where small cedars grow among the bamboos. The body lay face up and was clothed in a light blue hunting robe with a courtier's hat from the capital. The wound was caused by just a single sword stroke, but it was to his chest, and so the bamboo leaves around him were stained with dark blood. No, he was no longer bleeding. The wood seemed to be dry already. What's more, a huge horsefly was clinging to the wound as if it didn't hear my footsteps. Did I see a long sword? No, there was nothing. There was only a piece of rope at the foot of a nearby cedar. And then, yes, there was only a comb in addition to the rope. These were the only two items near the corpse, but the grass and bamboo leaves were completely trampled, so the man must have struggled painfully before being killed. Was there no horse? There's no chance a horse could enter there. A thicket separates it from the road where horses pass. Okay, so that's the end of testimony 1. Most of these testimonies are very short. The longest are by the 3 main characters. Okay, that's now moving back to my little speech. Okay, so you'll note that Masago does not appear in that testimony directly. She has not yet been made of the object of male desire, and therefore does not yet exist. Of course, at the end of the story, she goes beyond the mere object of male desire and becomes this kind of enormous subjectivity that swallows up the whole text. But we'll get to that later. In testimony 2, now we move to testimony 2, Masago represents woman as enigma. This testimony is given by the traveling priest. He describes how he caught a glimpse of Masago, whose face is veiled in a dark red and blue cloth, an image evoking a mood of mystery and exoticism. She is the enigmatic noblewoman behind the screen, much like the female archetype that appears in so many of Tanizaki's works. Okay, so Tanizaki was a major influence on Akutagawa, so I think some of Tanizaki's female archetypes might have found their way into Akutagawa's literary imagination. She is the enigmatic noblewoman here in this testimony. The fact that he is a Buddhist priest may also explain why he refers to her only indirectly, as women are generally regarded as impure in Buddhist teachings. Okay, so he doesn't want to refer to her directly because he's a priest. Okay, so now I will read the translation of Testimony 2, the story of a traveling priest questioned by the Grand Magistrate. I believe I met the deceased man yesterday. It was, about noon yesterday. The location was on the road from Sekiyama to Yamashina. He was leading a woman on a horse toward the barrier. She was wearing a cloth covering over her head, so I never saw her face. The only thing that I saw was the color of the cloth. I believe it was a dark red and blue pattern. The horse was reddish dapple gray with its mane cropped close. Its height, I think it must have been more than 4 feet. But of course, as a priest, I know little of these matters. The man carried a bow along with the sword he had at his side. I still remember the 20 or so arrows stuck in his black lacquered quiver. I never dreamed he would end up like this. Truly, human life is as ephemeral as dew and as brief as lightning. Ah, what a terrible, sad fate. Okay, so the woman's figure just barely, we get a tiny little glimpse of it here in this testimony. In the first testimony, she was completely absent, and she's slowly coming into being as we progress and move along in this story. Okay, now moving on to testimony number 3. In testimony number 3, Masago represents woman as anonymous object of male desire. Here the magistrate describes Tajio as a lustful onnazuki, a fancier of women, implying that the young, attractive Masago would have been a likely target. Okay, so she's an anonymous object of male desire, in this testimony. The magistrate does not directly mention Masago, and we learn nothing new about Masago's appearance or character, yet she is alluded to as a potential target of male desire, i.e. as anonymous object of male desire. Alright, it's a little repetitive. Testimony 3. Okay, testimony 3 by the Grand Magistrate. The story of a police official questioned by... Story of a police official questioned by the... Okay, note that the police official has been trying to capture Tajio Mata for a long time, so he has some skin in the game, an ulterior motive. The man I captured, he is most certainly Tajio Mata, the notorious bandit. Of course, when I caught him, he'd fallen from his horse and he was moaning in pain on the stone bridge at Awataguchi. The time? It was last night, soon after the first watch of the evening. When I nearly captured him the time before, he was also carrying this long sword and wearing this dark blue hunting robe. Yet this time, as you see, he also had a bow. Is that so? The dead man was also carrying one. Well, then, the murderer must be none other than Tajio Mata. See, he doesn't have enough evidence at this point, but he's still jumping to the conclusion that Tajio Mata was in fact the murderer of Takehiko. Takehiro. The leather-covered bow with black lacquer quiver, the 17 arrows with hawk-feathered quills, these must have belonged to the man. Yes, just as you say, the horse is a reddish dapple gray with a short-cropped mane. It must have been an act of providence he was thrown by that animal. It was standing just beyond the bridge, dragging its long halter and eating grass by the roadside. Of all the bandits lurking about the capital, this Tajio Mata is especially known to target women. It's rumored he was behind the murder of a woman and a young girl in the mountains behind the Pindola at the Toribe temple last autumn. If he did kill the man, there's no telling what he may have done with the woman on the gray horse. It's not my place to say so, but won't you investigate this matter as well? Okay, so here, in testimony 3, the police official describes the woman as a target and as a victim. Okay, so woman as victim we could add to this testimony. Okay, so you should be getting a sense that in each of these testimonies we get a different archetype or a different image of the female character presented. In testimony 4, Masago represents woman as obedient daughter and faithful wife. Okay, so filial daughter, filial piety. She's an embodiment of filial piety in this testimony. The 4th testimony is given by Masago's mother. Here, for the first time, we are given her name and age. Okay. So the details of her character are beginning to fill out a little bit more, even though each testimony presents a certain fixed archetype of Masago. So they're not entirely accurate, representative of the true Masago. We're getting a fuller picture of her character. Here for the first time we are given her name and age. She is 19. Her appearance is also described in some details. She has an oval-shaped face, urizane gao. Urizane gao, literally a melon, not a melon. Melon, I guess we could say, shaped face is the sort of ideal in the Heian period for a beautiful woman. Urizane gao, a slightly dark complexion, and a birthmark under her left eye. So specific features of her appearance are given. We are also told that she is strong-willed, somewhat boyish, and faithful as Takehiko's wife. Okay, so the mother's presenting her daughter as somewhat boyish to prevent the police or the Grand Magistrate from assuming that she brought on the rape or kind of flirted with Tajio Mata. Masago's mother stresses her daughter's fidelity and chastity and filial piety, pointing out that she had maintained her virginity until marriage. Masago is portrayed here through a filter of maternal concern as an obedient daughter and faithful wife, i.e., as a woman who follows the rules and dictates of Confucian patriarchal society. Okay? That's testimony 4. We get this sort of Confucian archetype of Masago. So I will now read testimony 4. The story of an old woman. Okay, so in the original it says onna with a different kanji for onna. The story of an old woman, namely her mother, questioned by the Grand Magistrate. Yes, this dead man is my daughter's husband, but he's not from the capital. He's a samurai from the province of Wakasa. His name was Kanazawa no Takehiko, and he was 26 years of age. No, he had a gentle nature, so he wouldn't have had any enemies. My daughter, her name is Masago, and she's 19 years old. She's strong-willed like a man, so she's never known any man other than Takehiko. Her face is small and oval-shaped, slightly dark with a birthmark under her left eye. Takehiko left for Wakasa yesterday with my daughter. What a terrible fate to end up like this. But what has happened to my daughter? I'm resigned to my son-in-law's fate, but I'm still worried about her. Please, my only request is that you find my daughter, even if you have to bend every blade of grass. How I hate that thief Tajio. If he killed not only my son, but my daughter too. Her voice trails off into sobbing. Okay, note that this work is famous for not having a narrator. There's no first-person narrator or third-person narrator. There's just 7 testimonies given directly. However, there are some stage directions thrown into each testimony, or several of the testimonies. In this testimony, we see at the very end, the stage direction, her voice trails off into sobbing. So these stage directions are the only kind of hints of a narrator or author who is kind of lurking above the work. That's just a side note there. Okay, moving on now to next we have testimony 5 now is the next one. In testimony 5, Masago represents woman as kindai jose, or modern woman. Clever, cunning, attractive, and self-assertive modern woman, kindai jose. This archetype overlaps with the modern gado or moga archetype that appeared in Japan around 1923. So in the late Taisho period and continuing on into the early Showa period, the modern gado is a kind of a new archetype that appeared on the scene in Japan's society and in literature as well, and you see it in the works of Tanizaki, for example, and other works of the period, the modern gado. So we see traces of the modern gado archetype in this testimony here, which is given by Masago herself. This testimony gives a confession of Tajio. This is Tajio's confession, testimony 5. This testimony gives a confession of Tajio, renowned rebel, bandit, and womanizer. He begins his testimony by asserting that he did not murder Masago, and that he knows nothing of her current whereabouts. Okay, so keep in mind that he's resigned to die. He's already said that, give me the death sentence, execute me. He doesn't mind. So, presumably he has nothing to hide. So it seems pretty likely that he is not lying about not having murdered Masago, is my interpretation of this. And that he knows nothing of her current whereabouts. He describes his first glimpse of her in quasi-religious terms. So I think he's sincere about having sort of been awestruck or infatuated with her from at first sight. She struck him as beautiful, refined, even bodhisattva-like. He describes how she literally remained on her high horse while he led her greedy, materialistic, proto-petite bourgeois husband Takehiko to the treasure that he swore was buried in the grove. Okay, the treasure, of course, doesn't exist. It was a lie to get him in there so that he could take his wife. Of course, there was never any treasure, and after tying up the husband, Tajio Mada returns for his prey. Masago valiantly resists Tajio Mada's advances, but she is eventually subdued and dragged into the grove to be raped in front of her husband. So I'm still relating Tajio Mada's testimony here. To be raped in front of her husband. So his initial intention was rape. Either during or immediately after the rape, Masago presumably forms a wild attachment to Tajio Mada. Okay, this is still according to Tajio Mada. He began with the intention of raping her, but she sort of fell in love with him as things were progressing. When Tajio Mada suggests that they have no choice now but to get married, she commands the two men to a duel, promising herself to the winner. Takehiko takes up the challenge, but while the two men are fighting, Masago cleverly or cunningly takes the opportunity to flee and report Tajio Mada to the authorities. So she outwitted him, according to his testimony. By Tajio Mada's account, Masago is a clever, independent, and calculating modern woman, kindai jose, with a knack for self-preservation. Okay, so that's the sort of archetype that we get in Testimony 5, which is by Tajio Mada, and now I will read Testimony 5, which is one of the longer testimonies in the work. Tajio Mada's confession. Yes, I killed the man, but not the woman. Then where is she? That I don't know. Wait a minute. No matter how much you torture me, I can't tell you what I don't know. And now that you've caught me, I have no intention of hiding anything like a coward. It was yesterday, just past noon, when I saw the man and woman. A slight breeze happened to lift the woman's veil, and I caught a glimpse of her face. One brief look, and the next moment it was hidden again. Maybe it was because I only caught a glimpse, but the woman's face seemed to me like a bodhisattva's. In that one instant, I decided to make her mine, even if it meant killing the man. Killing a man is not as difficult as you may think. If I wanted to have the woman, I had to kill him. Of course, when I kill a man, I use the sword at my side. But you authorities, you policemen, you don't even use swords. You kill with power and money. So we get Tajio Mada as a kind of revolutionary, a Che Guevara type. Communist almost here. You don't even use swords. You kill with power and money. Sometimes you even kill with words that sound like they're full of kindness. There may be no blood, and the man may still breathe, but you've killed him all the same. So he's talking about exploitation and economic oppression and so forth. When you think about it, it's not so easy to tell who is guiltier, you or I. An ironic smile is the stage direction thrown in there. Still, I would have been happy to have her without killing the man. In fact, I decided to take the woman without killing him if I could. But that was impossible in the middle of the Yamashina Station Road, so I hatched a plan to lure them into the mountains. It was a simple plan. I fell in with them and told them a story, that I'd discovered an old tomb up in the mountains filled with swords and mirrors, and that I'd buried them in a grove in the shadow of the mountains unknown to anyone. If I could only find someone to take them, I'd be willing to sell them off cheaply. As I spoke, the man grew more and more interested in my story. And then, well, greed is a terrifying thing. In half an instant, the two of them were following me with their horse up the mountain path. When we came to the grove, I said the treasure was buried inside and told them to come have a look. The man was consumed with desire, so of course he agreed. But the woman stayed on her horse and said she would wait. It was only natural after seeing that thick grove. In fact, this fell into my plan perfectly. So I left her alone and entered the grove with the man. For a while the grove is just bamboo. But some 50 meters in, there's a stand of cedars that opens up a bit. There was no better place to carry out my scheme. Pushing my way through the trees, I uttered a believable enough lie that the treasure was buried by the cedars. When the man heard these words, he rushed forward towards the trees. As the bamboo thinned out, we came to the place where the cedars grow. But as soon as we had reached this place, I pinned him to the ground. He had a long sword by his side and seemed strong enough, but caught by surprise like that, there was nothing he could do. Soon enough, he was bound to the trunk of a nearby cedar. The rope? A rope is indispensable for a thief like me, since you never know when you might have to scale a wall. I had it by my side. I stuffed bamboo leaves into his mouth so he wouldn't cry, and it was all over. After dealing with the man, I returned to the woman and told her that he'd suddenly fallen ill, that she'd better come have a look. There's no need to tell you I was on the mark once more. The woman took off her sedge hat and I led her by the hand into the grove. When we came to the clearing, she saw the man tied to the base of a tree. One look and she quickly drew a dagger from her sleeve. I've never seen such a strong-willed woman. So underline strong-willed. He's presenting her as a very strong-willed, cunning, clever woman who gets what she wants and does what she wants. Such a strong-willed woman. If I'd let my guard down for an instant, she would have stabbed me in the side. Even dodging her blade, as she swung wildly at me, I couldn't have been injured. But I'm Tajio after all, so I took the dagger from her without even drawing my sword. Strong as she was helpless without a weapon. At last, just as I had planned, I was able to take her without killing the man. Yes, without killing him. I had no desire to take his life on top of it all. I left the woman sobbing on the ground behind me and was about to run from the grove when she grabbed onto my arm as if she'd gone mad. And when I listened to her words through her sobbing, I found she was saying, "One of you must die, either you or my husband. It's worse than death," she said, "to be shamed like this before two men." She even said, through her tears, that she would follow whomever was left alive. Then I was seized with a brutal urge to kill the man. A dark excitement in stage directions there. When you hear this, you must think I'm more cruel than you are. But that's because you didn't see her face just then. Because you didn't see her eyes at that moment lit up like fire. When I looked into her eyes, I felt a desire to make her my wife, even if it meant being struck down by lightning. To make her my wife, this was the only thought in my mind. It was not just a question of mere lust, as you might think. If it were only lust, I would have kicked her down and run away. Then the man would have been spared from staining my blade with his blood. Yet as I stared into the woman's face in that shadowy grove, I knew I couldn't leave there without killing him. But even though I decided to take his life, I refused to kill him like a coward. I cut his bonds and told him to take up his sword. The rope you found at the root of the tree was the one I threw down just then. The man was pale as he drew his sword. Without a word, he jumped at me savagely. There's no need to tell you the outcome of the duel. My blade found his chest on the 23rd stroke. On the 23rd stroke, make sure you take note of it. I'm still impressed by the fact. No one else has ever crossed swords with me 20 times. Energetic laughter. As soon as he fell, I threw down my bloody sword and turned back to the woman. But then, yes, she was nowhere to be found. I searched the stand of cedars, but there was no trace of her left among the fallen bamboo leaves. I tried to listen for her, but all I could hear was the death rattle in the man's throat. Maybe she ran from the grove to call for help when our sword fight began. When that thought crossed my mind, I knew my own life was in danger, so I grabbed the man's sword and his bow and arrows and ran back to the mountain path. I found the woman's horse there, grazing quietly on the grass. It's a waste of time to describe what happened next, but before I entered the capital, I got rid of the man's sword. That's the end of my confession. All along, I knew I would hang from the gallows one day, so go ahead and do your worst. A defiant attitude. Okay, note too that, I think I mentioned this in the other study guide video about this work, that each of the three main characters, the woman, Masago, her husband Takehiko, and the bandit Tajio, all claim to be the murderers. None of them deny the accusation of murder. They all say that they are responsible for Takehiko's death. Alright, moving on now to, where are we? Okay, testimony 5. Now we are at the next testimony. Testimony 6. In testimony 6, Masago, this is her own testimony. Testimony 6 is Masago's testimony. In this testimony, Masago represents the faithful and obedient ideal, faithful, obedient, and filial ideal of Confucian societies. Okay, so note that the archetype that she puts forth of herself in this testimony is very similar to the archetype put forth by her mother in her mother's testimony above. In testimony 6, Masago represents the faithful and obedient and filial ideal of Confucian societies. This testimony is that of Masago herself, now a nun, confessing from her convent. Okay, Confucian, I should say Buddhist here. She gives a kind of Buddhist. There are Buddhist themes or resonances that run through this testimony, which we did not find in her mother's testimony. That's an important point to make. She's a nun now, confessing from her convent. She's renounced the world, renounced desires, and all of that stuff. Bon no. Predictably, she presents herself as a devout wife who, after being submitted to a humiliating rape, rushed to the side of her bound and gagged husband. Yet instead of coming to her aid, her conventionally minded husband, having witnessed her defilement, simply stares at her contemptuously. Even after Tajio is gone, Takehiko continues to glare at her in disgust. We might ask here, what does Takehiko know that we don't? Did he witness, perhaps, his wife enjoying her encounter, her rape, her sexual encounter with Tajio? But the strong-willed Masago is not about to let Takehiko define her as a promiscuous woman. She makes a proposal. Now that she has been shamed, she has no choice but to die. Only there is a catch. Having witnessed her shame, Takehiko must die first. Takehiko accedes to this request by her, and presumably asks his wife to kill him. Okay, this is still Takehiko's account. It is of course possible that Masago, deliberately misheard his request, as his mouth is still stuffed with leaves. Masago succeeds in killing him, yet fails, and perhaps this was her plan all along, to fulfill her end of the bargain by taking her own life. Her testimony ends with her repeating her line about how ashamed she is, revealing an occasional smile between her tears. Okay, so this is Masago's, we're still in Masago's testimony. She presents herself basically as a double victim. Okay, we've seen her presented as a victim earlier, but here she's a double victim. First, she presents herself as being a victim to Tajio. She was raped by him, and then she's victimized by her own husband, who regards her as defiled, having been raped by this man. So she's doubly victimized, according to her story. In short, Masago has gone to great lengths to present herself as devout, principled, self-sacrificing, victimized, doubly victimized, and ultimately weak woman who conforms to the rules of propriety of the male-dominated order, social order. Okay? So now I will read Masago's own testimony, which was one of the 3 main testimonies in the work. So let us read it very carefully. This is a confession. The confession of the woman who came to Kiyomizu Temple. After the man wearing the dark blue robe raped me, he looked at my husband bound to the tree and laughed mockingly. How mortified my husband must have felt. No matter how hard he struggled, the cord binding him only bit deeper into his body. Without even thinking, I stumbled over to his side. She's presenting herself as the good wife, the loyal wife. I stumbled over to his side. No, I tried to run over to him when the man kicked me down to the ground. It was just then. In my husband's eyes I saw an indescribable light. Even now when I recall his eyes, I can't help but tremble. Even though he could not speak, he said everything in his heart with that one look. It was not a look of anger or even sadness, but one of icy contempt. It was that look, rather than the man's kick, that made me cry out and finally lose consciousness. When I awoke, the man in the dark blue robe had left. Only my husband remained, still tied to the base of the cedar. Finally, I raised myself from the bamboo leaves and looked into his eyes once more. Yet the expression in his eyes had not changed. They still had the same cold look of contempt tinged with hatred. Shame, despair, anger. I don't know how to describe my feelings at that moment. I stood up trembling and approached his side. Now that things have come to this, I cannot stay with you any longer. I am resigned to die. Yet I ask you to die as well. You have witnessed my shame. I cannot leave you alive by yourself this way. It took all of my strength to say this. Yet still my husband looked at me with disdain. I clutched my breast, which felt as if it were torn asunder, and looked for his long sword. But the thief must have taken it, for the sword and even the bow and arrows were nowhere to be seen in the grove. Yet fortunately my dagger, at least, was on the ground by my feet. I raised the dagger and then spoke once again to my husband. Then I ask you to give your life to me. I will follow soon after. And of course you have to ask yourself, does she really intend to follow him soon after when she says this? When he heard these words, he finally moved his lips. Of course his mouth was filled with bamboo leaves, so no sound emerged. But when I saw his face, I understood what he was trying to say. Still eyeing me with contempt, he had said simply, "Kill me." Then, as if in a dream, I stabbed my husband's chest through his silk robe. I must have fainted once more. When I was able to look about at last, my husband, still bound, was long dead. The western sun cast a single beam of light on his pale face through the bamboo and cedar trees. Stifling my tears, I unbound his body and cast the rope aside. And then what happened to me? I have no strength left to speak of it. In any case, I didn't have the strength to take my own life. I pressed the dagger to my neck, threw myself into the lake at the foot of the mountains, and tried every other way to kill myself. Living on like this, without even the strength to die, brings me only shame. And of course you have to ask yourself, is she lying here? Did she really try to kill herself, as she said, after witnessing her husband's death? And the answer is probably no, I think, in my opinion. And stage directions here, a sad smile. So this sad smile is kind of important. It's giving us a hint that she might be lying. Even the merciful Kannon Bodhisattva must have forsaken such an unfortunate woman as I. After killing my husband, being raped by the thief, so she's doubly victimized, triply victimized really. She was raped by the thief, was scorned by her husband, and then was forced to kill her husband, a third kind of victimization. So she's triply victimized really. What is left for me? What am I to do? Stage direction suddenly. Fierce sobbing. Okay, these fierce sobbings at the end might be a performance, keep in mind. Okay, now we move on to the last testimony. In the seventh and final testimony, okay, this final testimony is given by Takehiko, right? Her husband. The ghost of Takehiko. In the seventh and final testimony, Masago represents woman as pure, unbridled desire or will. Okay, without any fidelity to a husband, without any filial piety, completely selfish, looking out for herself. This testimony is that of the ghost of Takehiko, spoken through a medium. After witnessing his wife's rape, Takehiko watches jealously as Masago is consoled by her sweet-talking bad boy rapist/lover. She appears to be falling for him. Okay, this is all according to the ghost of Takehiko, keep in mind. She appears to be falling for him and eventually asks him to take her away with him. As if to corroborate René Girard's theory that desire is always triangulated, it is precisely at this moment that Masago appears to her husband Takehiko more beautiful than ever. Masago then makes his startling demand. Tajio must kill Takehiko so that she may preserve her reputation. Tajio refuses to obey her merciless order, and in the ensuing confusion she flees. Okay, so according to Takehiko, his wife commanded Tajio to kill him. Tajio, however, refuses to obey her merciless order, and in the ensuing confusion she flees. For the first time in his life, Takehiko has seen his wife as she truly is. Murderous. As she truly is, as the embodiment of pure, unbridled female desire or will, and he is so horrified by what he sees that he plunges the dagger into his breast and kills himself. Thus, through Takehiko's account, no doubt the most credible of all the accounts, the real Masago, and by extension, truth itself, the truth of woman, according to Akutagawa, I should say. I should have said that at the beginning. This is not the truth of woman in some sort of universal sense. It's the truth of woman as Akutagawa, I think, sees it. And you can argue, reading many of his late works, that he regards the truth of woman as this truth of woman that is presented in this story. Thus, through Takehiko's account, no doubt the most credible of all accounts, the real Masago, and by extension truth itself, truth of woman, is revealed. Masago is revealed to be a very beautiful, very powerful, very willful, very vain, and very ruthless femme fatale. Okay, so she's the femme fatale archetype in this final testimony. Capable of anything, even mariticide. Okay, the murder of one's husband. Alright, and that's my description of this final testimony. Now let us read it. Final testimony, the story of the ghost told by a medium. So this is Takehiko's ghost speaking through a medium here. After raping my wife, the thief sat by her side on the ground, consoling her in various ways. Of course I couldn't speak. My body was bound to the base of the tree. Yet the whole time I tried to make eye contact with my wife. Don't believe anything this man says, no matter what he says. Don't trust him. I tried to communicate such thoughts to her, but my wife sat there vacantly among the fallen leaves and stared quietly into her lap. Did it not appear to me as if she was listening to the thief? I struggled with feelings of jealousy. So he's the jealous, vengeful ghost that comes back to haunt the dead, right? So he's drawing from literary elements that you find in the Heian period here. I struggled with feelings of jealousy. He's a onryo, shiniryo. Yet the thief moved skillfully from one argument to another. Now that your body has been violated, things will not go well between you and your husband. Why not leave him and be my wife instead? It was only because of your beauty that I did such a thing. These were the brazen things he said in the end. After listening to him, my wife raised her head as though spellbound. I have never seen her as beautiful as she was at that moment. You note that at the moment she's been taken from him, she appears most beautiful. Yet what did this beautiful wife of mine say to the thief as I sat bound in front of her? Even as I wander in the darkness, the yoni in the Japanese I think it says, even as I wander in the darkness, every time I recall my wife's words, I burn with anger. In a clear voice she said, "Then take me with you anywhere." Then take me with you anywhere. A long silence, stage directions. That was not the extent of my wife's scene. Okay, so she did not betray him simply by trying to abandon him, but now she makes the command to kill him. That was not the extent of my wife's scene. It was, if it were, I would not suffer as I do here in the abyss. She grasped the thief's hand as though in a dream, and was about to leave the grove, when suddenly the color drained from her face, and she pointed to me as I sat bound to the cedar. "Kill that man! As long as he is alive, I cannot be with you." As though she had gone mad, my wife screamed these words over and over. "Kill that man!" Even now, like some tempest, these words threatened to blast me in the faraway darkness. Have such hateful words ever been uttered by human mouth? Have human ears ever heard such cursed words? Have ever... Suddenly scattered mocking laughter. Ah ha 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 ha. Even the thief paled when he heard those words. "Kill that man!" my wife screamed as she clung to his arm. He stared at her and did not say whether he would kill me. Suddenly he kicked her down onto the fallen bamboo leaves. Once more scattered mocking laughter. Ha 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 ha. The thief quietly folded his arms and looked at me. "What do you want me to do with this woman? Kill her or spare her?" Just nod in response. "Shall I kill her?" For these words I can almost forgive the thief his crimes. Again a long silence. While I hesitated, my wife screamed and ran off into the thicket. The thief sprang after her, but he was unable to grasp even her sleeve. I stared at the scene before me as if I was some kind of phantasm. After my wife had run off, the thief picked up the long sword and my bows and arrows, and he cut the rope binding me in a single spot. Now my own life's in danger. I remember him muttering these words as he left the grove. Afterwards all was still. No, there still lingered the sound of someone crying. I listened carefully as I undid my bonds. Then I realized the sobbing voice was my own. For the third time, a long silence. Stage directions. At last I raised my spent body from the base of the cedar. My wife's fallen dagger glinted on the ground before me. I took it in my hand and stabbed myself once in the chest. Okay, so again he's saying that he is responsible for his own death. Masago is saying that she is responsible for her husband's death. And Tajio is saying that he is responsible for the man's death. They all claim responsibility for the death. Note that important point. I could feel something raw coming up into my mouth. Yet there was no pain. Only as my chest grew colder, the surrounding world grew ever more still. Ah, what stillness! Not even a bird in the sky above this grove in the shadows of the mountains. Only a lonely shaft of sunlight behind the cedars and bamboo. The shaft of sunlight, even that gradually dimmed. Then even the cedars and bamboo were no longer visible. As I lay there, I was enveloped in deep stillness. Then someone approached me with stealthy footsteps. I tried to look over, but by then the darkness had pressed in all around me. The hand of someone I couldn't see, suddenly drew the dagger from my chest. At the same time, blood surged into my mouth once more, and I sank forever into the blackness of the abyss. Okay, so who is this last figure that appears to take the sword out of him? It could be the Kigori. The Kigori said he found the body dead, but he could be lying. And it might be the case that he found the body still alive and he pulled the dagger out, but he didn't want to admit that fact because it might make him look guilty, so he lied about it. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that his wife pitied him and came back and removed the sword, either to make sure he's dead, not out of pity, just to make sure that he did not survive the incident, or out of pity to relieve his suffering and put him out of his misery. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is that Tajio came back and removed the sword. So that's one of the many ambiguities in this text, this last final paragraph. Okay, moving back to our main points though. Okay, so in this last testimony by Takehiko through the medium presents Masago as a kind of beautiful, powerful, willful, vain, and ruthless femme fatale figure. All right, an akujo. Dokujo, I think is what's the word? Poisonous woman, villainous woman, which is another literary archetype, female archetype that is very popular in the 1920s. So Akutagawa, of course, is drawing from that these other works of the time. All right, in this essay, I have argued that despite its reputation as a parable about modern perspectivism, the unknowability of truth, and the breakdown of totalizing worldviews, Akutagawa's Yabu no Naka is in fact a meditation on the true nature of woman. What is woman? This true nature, which is revealed in the final testimony, stands in stark contrast to the various archetypes presented in the other testimonies, which reflect the views and the constructions of the male-dominated society, both of the Heian period, which is the source of the original text, the Konjaku Monogatari Shu, and the Taisho period, 20th century Japan as well. By walking through each of the 7 testimonies, I've shown how each testimony presents a false or insufficient view of Masago, and that the final testimony is probably closest to the truth of what she really was. Alright, that's the end of this short paper, short speech that also included the full text within it. Alright, if you have any questions or any complaints or any bones to pick with this interpretation of the text, send me an email or write something in the comments below. That is all for now. Goodbye.